Even in the early days of the Galactic Civil War, Mon Mothma and the Rebellion learned just how powerful the Empire could be during Operation Domino, where rebel sector forces across the galaxy were involved in uprisings and more traditional fighting against the Imperial Army, and they were all completely crushed, pushing the Alliance towards the guerrilla tactics we mostly know them for. Mon Mothma and the Sector Force leadership at the time had believed if some planets could win and defend themselves behind planetary shields, more planets would be able to resist in a kind of domino effect, a reference to the real-world domino theory popular in American political discourse in the Cold War, which argued as countries fell to communism, more would follow in their wake. This also means Domino's are canon, but hopefully not Domino's Pizza. Despite the Empire showing the capability to defeat these kinds of uprisings, even their power had limits, and in many cases concessions to local governments and factions were necessary, or at least the appearance of concessions were, even if in many cases they didn't actually come with actual authority. At the lower end of these were the so-called Allied sectors, a grouping of enclaves historically associated with specific regions or even species who had some kind of self-government within periods of the Republic, though that autonomy was often long gone by the Imperial period, despite usually ceremonial claims to the contrary. Among these were the Bothans, who ultimately allied with the Rebellion, supplying them with information through their oxymoronically famous spy network. There was also Herglick space, the Herglicks being one of the most powerful species in the pre-Republic galaxy. One step up from the Republic's historic allied regions were some territories which did have some autonomy under the Empire, but that autonomy was undercut somewhat by being run by an appointee or ally of Palpatine, like the Centrality. The Centrality was anything but central in the galaxy, existing spinward of even Hutt space, and it had been at least nominally independent since its founding 3.5 millennia before the Empire. Its proximity to Hutt space often meant this independence had a huge asterisk, and required answering to the Hutt Khajiitics or clans. While the government of the Centrality was human-dominated, the Centrality included some ancient alien civilizations like the Sharu, whose legendary mind harp could allegedly be used in the re-establishment of their ancient civilization. It also contained the Open Sea, a largely empty section of space, and the Thonbaka Nebula, home of the spacefaring manta ray-like Oswaft species. As the Empire's power grew, it displaced the Hutts as the overlords of the Centrality, and Palpatine installed Roker Gepta in control on behalf of the Empire. He was a member of the Sorcerers of Tund, a secretive dark side sect from a planet within the Centrality. Gepta was a member of the slug-like croak species disguised in a mostly human form, and he remained in control until his death around a year before Endor, after coming into conflict with Lando Calrissian in some of the weirdest Star Wars books. There were, however, some areas which remained independent not just in name but in practice, as long as they didn't give the Empire reason to properly subjugate them. 3 groups stand out as particularly notable in this category. First are the Hutts, former overlords of the Centrality. Their territory, or at least their sphere of influence, which may as well have been their territory, significantly shrunk from covering around a third of the galaxy before and during the Clone Wars to covering just the core Hutt space as the Empire grew. This left worlds which were traditionally out of Coruscant's reach in Nal Huttas either entirely under the Empire's control or controlled by a mix of Imperial authority and Hutt influence, like Tatooine seems to have been. Hutt space became nominally part of the Empire under the authority of the Moff of the Baxil sector, but the Hutt version of the treaty called him a consul rather than a Moff, and credits were always a way to make Moffs or consuls, whichever you prefer, look away from the Hutts in their dealings. While the Empire theoretically outlawed private slavery, it maintained a massive state-sponsored slavery program, and areas like Hutt space were exempt from these provisions, so in the end it changed very little for how the Hutts managed their businesses. For any of the areas in the galaxy that slavery was still allowed, Hutt influence would soon follow. For the Empire's part, the Hutt cartels operating under control of the organized Khajiitics and the Hutt Council were far more manageable and agreeable to Imperial interests than what may have arisen if the Empire tried to apply too much force too fast. Occasionally the Hutts did become subject to actual Imperial force, like with a failed assault on Nar Shaddaa and the annexation of the planet Sreeler. Aside from that kind of incident, as long as the tax kept flowing, the Hutts were largely left to their own devices. The Hutts tended to keep their few existing fleets hidden in the Batana Hutta region, or the Garden of the Hutts, far away from prying Imperial eyes. Key to the Hutt strategy of surviving the galaxy throughout the last 15,000 years of galactic history was the idea that if they didn't pose an immediate threat to the government of the day, then they would probably be left alone. The Empire was just the latest in a long line of forms the Republic had taken, and which had to be appeased to go about their day-to-day lives. The Hapes Consortium is the second and probably most independent of the little rump states of the galaxy under the Empire. Unlike the others, the Hapens arguably don't fit the definition of a client kingdom, making this video absolute clickbait, so remember to subscribe for more. The Hapens were a xenophobic, insular matriarchal monarchy within the Hapes cluster, a small, dense region of space with at least 63 inhabited planets, defended by difficult-to-navigate nebulae. Hapen society started 4,000 years before the Empire, with the Laurel Raiders, pirates who had been hunted by the Jedi, leading to hatred for the Jedi, joining massive value being placed on physical beauty in the pantheon of Hapen ideals. This highly structured society had a reasonably strong and well-disciplined standing military, but while they were able to steal many ships from Imperial patrols, which they attempted to gift to the New Republic in exchange for Leia marrying their Princess Solder years later, they would never have been able to survive against focused Imperial power. According to the Essential Atlas, this lack of a crackdown against the Hapens led many to believe that Palpatine was a secret devotee of Hapen culture, or that he and the Queen Mother of the Hapens were more than just galactic neighbors. But the reality was they probably weren't a real threat, and only served as an example of what decadence and insularity could lead to, which is why Hapen Fleet was a term within the Imperial Navy for units which never saw any action. The final client state was a creation of the late Republic and the Empire itself, the Corporate Sector Authority. The Corporate Sector, without the Authority, was an area of space colonized under the authority of corporations hundreds of years before the Clone Wars, where they mostly sided with the megacorporations of the CIS. During the war, loyalists to the Republic within the galaxy's megacorporations, like the House of Tag, urged nationalization for the corporations within its territory, forming the Corporate Sector Authority, which was able to police the sector while still paying taxes to the Empire. The Authority owned basically everything and everyone in the sector, controlling corporate activities and civilian life. The many migrants who arrived after the Authority's formation and the Empire's formation were given privileges as consumers rather than rights as citizens. This included many aliens who came to the sector to get away from the Imperial oppression, only to find that oppression under the CSA was often worse. Some of the other migrants were humans who came for the promise of broad economic opportunity in an empty and vast starscape of hundreds of procedurally generated untapped planets to colonize and explore, a promise which has existed since the initial planets of the sector were taken for corporate use centuries before. Some people found the lack of local sentient species weird, but this was quickly explained away by nonsense theories about local space phenomena. The reality was that many of these planets did in fact have indigenous species, which were either relocated or exterminated, including at least 11 by Tag's loyalist holdings alone. The CSA continued to happily pay the Empire its taxes while being possibly more exploitative and oppressive than the Empire. It was briefly taken over by Warlord Zinj after Endor. However, for the most part, the CSA remained independent even through the New Republic period, the Yuuzhan Vong War, and beyond. During the Second Galactic Civil War in the 40s ABY, the CSA joined the Corellians in their fight against the Galactic Alliance, suggesting that maybe it had been integrated in the Alliance at some point, otherwise it may have just been afraid that it was about to become the highest priority target for an otherwise unifying galaxy. There were some other powers which coexisted with the Empire, though most tended to be in the unknown regions. These three categories we've covered here today, and the last three examples of the client kingdoms, cover most of what life looked like for those who could claim to not be true Imperial subjects, to varying degrees. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.